Excuse me, with your indulgence, I don't know if this is going to work. Can everybody hear me? Is this okay? And I'm not sure if this is being taped, so I'm also sort of a little bit concerned about that. I tend to do better standing, so if you don't mind that, at least I won't go to sleep, even if some of you do. The talk I'm going to give today is one that has developed out of a series of essays that I have been writing over the past decade or so, and it reflects my involvement in the emerging field of environmental history, as well as sort of California-style world history, in particular a corner of it that is known as big history. And I can certainly, in question period or informally later, tell you more about sort of the particular trajectory that brings me here this morning. So I'm going to have to read this, unfortunately, and I am aware that not everybody's English is up to the same level, and I also am aware that I talk fast. I get enthusiastic. Maybe that's the Mediterranean in me, I don't know. Probably it's the Irish. In any event, I will do my best to talk at a regular pace, and if you find yourself getting lost, please do, and this is a sincere expression, raise your hand and I will try and slow down. The talk is one that will be unfamiliar to many of you as just as a style of intervention, because it is one that comes out of a field that does not exist, which is the world history at the global level. And so it is part of my mission today to try and convince you that there could be such a field, that there needs to be such a field, and that it is high time that historians got involved in it, rather than leaving it to the likes of economists and political scientists and sociologists. So it's time for historians to reclaim this turf that once was ours, but in the parting of the disciplinary continents that led to the modern university, somehow we abandoned this particular ship, possibly in haste, and maybe it's time to get back on it, because I think it can take us places we might like to go. The Mediterranean is one such. In an effort to bridge the gap between mutual incomprehensions, I'd like to reimagine the Mediterranean as a world space, a zone of comparative historical inquiry. By placing the history of the Mediterranean in a world historical context, our attention is directed away from internalist cultural models and towards larger eco-historical, structural, and institutional context in which modernity happened in the region. Of course, it happened in the world. Only by looking through a global lens can we make headway against the dominant state-centered nationalist narratives by which the different societies of the region have told their stories to the exclusion of others, as well as against the Orientalist representations that still durably intervene to cloud our understanding. First, some explanations. What I am proposing is a kind of a methodological thought experiment. The approach, which I have developed with my California world history colleagues, represents an effort to reclaim the global level for historians in order better to discipline lesser histories and thereby to encourage better history of all types. It may therefore be unfamiliar to some of you. Apologies in advance also for the abstract level of much of what follows, as well as the inevitable telegraphic nature of my prose. There is only so much you can pack into a 40-minute lecture. Finally, as we set out, a word of advice. Rather than getting stuck in particular details or assertions, many of which no doubt are wrong, direct your attention to the elements of the global level approach and the underlying argument. For the Gutenberg generation, I have promised Professor Yun Kasalila to make a text available. Historians, literary scholars, art historians, social scientists all have a stake in rethinking the Mediterranean. Where a particular disciplinary or regional literature leaves off, others can intervene to provide new questions, new sources of intellectual stimulation. In this vein, have a look at Ian Chambers' Mediterranean Crossings, The Politics of an Interrupted Modernity, for example. More recently, historians, he's not an historian, he's a literary scholar, have shown some signs of interest in reviving the Rodelian project, particularly focusing on the Eastern Mediterranean as an interactive zone. Here, in fact, the literature is beginning to add up to something special. For an example, see Molly Green's Catholic Pirates and Greek Merchants, a maritime history of the early Mediterranean. Or there is another recent book by Julia Clancy Smith, Mediterraneans, which seeks to develop the history of the central Mediterranean in the long 19th century. As you will learn in the course of this talk, much other great work is out there. Some of you may have read Horden and Purcell, British medievalists, whose Corrupting Sea is one intervention that has attracted attention. My approach here is in some respects the opposite of theirs, to world the transformations of the Mediterranean instead of breaking it into micro-ecological segments. How's that for telegraphic? The Mediterranean is central to the process of Europe's reinvention. As the first recipient of the 19th century liberal reform project in its political and economic forms, it was therefore also the site from which to begin the process of rethinking European modernities, plural. For some, it may also be a place to observe the ways in which Europe is currently itself being transformed. For all these reasons, we find the Mediterranean an important site for research and reflection in our present conjuncture. That this task is an urgent one is clear from a consideration of the ravages of divisive nationalisms in the recent past and the rise of various forms of Islamism in the present. As the proportion of Muslims steadily increases in the new Europe, the need for a Europe that generously incorporates the southern and eastern ends of the Mediterranean, perhaps even the interior of Africa, has increasingly made itself felt. However, due to the persistence of European racism and the legacy of colonialism, the political project of integrating the Mediterranean to the new Europe remains stalled. Arab suspicions of European motivations in calling for a new Europe and the persistence of racism, as well as European hegemonic aspirations, remain all too obvious. If the Mediterranean is to be only a European security zone, then sincere Arab and Muslim partners will be hard to find. A central problem in writing about the Mediterranean is that its history has been primarily written by Northern Europeans. Northern Europeans typically came to the cultures and peoples of the region with a set of agendas and expectations that shaped what they wrote. The problem of Orientalism is more encompassing than previously imagined, however. Not only the denizens of the Muslim Mediterranean were inspected by the lens of power, and not only under conditions of colonial rule. As Jane Schneider's Italy's Southern Question argues, the lens of power has significantly deformed knowledge about southern Italy as well. Much the same can be said about the histories of southern Spain, Portugal, and Greece. Moreover, once internalized, Orientalist discourse became a self-lacerating search for what went wrong amongst local intellectuals, obsessed with the ways in which their society somehow failed to measure up to Northern European standards. Orientalist histories operate as if the West was fated to achieve modernity thanks to its superior cultural attainments, the Greeks, science and democracy, and all that. While other societies, as a result of their inferior culture, remain trapped in the realm of the traditional, leaving the South, pick a South, any South, as the realm of tradition and stasis. In the view of this prior history, thinking about Mediterranean modernities from the vantage point of the Mediterranean must inevitably appear a quixotic project. Either it seems a naive exercise in denying history, the history of colonialism, or a cynical effort to annex the histories of the modern Muslim Mediterranean to the progress-oriented narrative of the new European globalization. The project of Mediterranean modernities decidedly carries a lot of historical baggage. The present intervention is an attempt to rethink the place of regional histories in world history using the Mediterranean region as an example. In the first part of this lecture, I make a case for the comparative history of the Mediterranean as a world space. Methodologically, my aim in developing a global comparative frame for exploring the history of the Mediterranean is to stimulate new approaches and more fruitful comparisons, directing our attention away from internalist cultural models and towards larger eco-historical, structural, and institutional contexts. For this reason, I seek to complicate the conventional story of how the region was transformed. To begin, I suggest that from a world historical point of view, the Mediterranean is a cultural fracture zone whose modern history contains deep structural continuities at the political and cultural levels, even as it displays equally obvious discontinuities. In a striking metaphor, Brodel summoned us to imagine a Mediterranean open to the Sahara and the West African interior, from the northern limits of the olive tree to the southern limits of the date palm, as he said. Ecologically, its intricate subdivisions into a host of internal seas, bays, and rivers, defined by its many peninsulas, mountains, and deserts, created a vast interactive zone, in effect, a world. Economic complementarity was structured in from the outside. The climate of the Mediterranean zone was affected both by the exceptional fertility of its river systems and fishing grounds, as well as by its exposure to the influence of the Eurasian steppe and the Sahara. Despite these complexities, the Mediterranean remains ecologically whole in some very complicated way that would take too long to unpack here right this minute. Viewed from a global historical perspective, the Mediterranean is culturally one place as well. This may be a startling thought. Living in 16th century China, Jesuit Matteo Ricci took enormous measures to distinguish Catholicism from Islam and Judaism. Buddhism too, but that's another story. The better to convert the Chinese. When finally granted an audience with the Chinese emperor to present his faith, all of his product differentiation went for naught. But they are wee-wee, the emperor cried, by which he meant Western monotheists, the Chinese not being interested in the complex distinctions amongst monotheists commonly made by Northwest Asians. So from a cultural point of view, from a Chinese point of view, it turns out that Mediterranean is actually one place. Let's return to the cultural unity within diversity theme from a different angle. File this under the question, where is the West? Western culture is in some complex ways, so we are told, derives from scriptural monotheism, Hellenism, sometimes known as Greek thought, and the heritage of ancient empires. However, all scriptural monotheists, Muslims and Jews among them, were fundamentally challenged by Greek thought. Similarly, the Western monotheisms were all in varying degrees shaped by debates over the limits of divine and imperial authority. Should the sword and the scepter, the state and religion, be united? Jews, Christians, and Muslims individually and severally struggled over these questions for millennia, though they drew somewhat different lessons from them. Finally, the Mediterranean is marked by the heritage of Roman law. As viewed from China, Roman law shaped the legal systems of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, structuring not only their own religious legal traditions, but also alternatives to it. The resulting family resemblance can be observed all around the Mediterranean. Confucian and Hindu legal traditions were animated by quite different concerns and gave rise to rather different structural and cultural instantiations, which prompts the following question. Is Islam Western, to employ a much discredited binary? Viewed from China, the answer is clearly yes. Viewed from China, the Mediterranean is a cultural whole. Well, where is the Mediterranean? The question, apparently innocent, leads us away from the familiar inner sea of the classical era and toward the realization that it depends upon when and why we ask the question. Rather than a fixed space, we might want to imagine a Mediterranean with differing modalities, or as we say in French, a géométrie variable. In a striking metaphor, Brodel called for us to imagine a Mediterranean open to the Sahara and the West African interior. In a similar spirit, given well-attested connections, cultural, economic, and political, between the Eastern Mediterranean civilizations and those of the Indus Valley, world historian Ross E. Dunn has suggested that it may be useful to imagine the rise of the classical civilizations of antiquity as occurring in a supra-regional space he calls Indo-Mediterranea. So I'm talking about sort of deep cultural substrates here. So that what I'm trying to do is to suggest that indeed, viewed from a world historical point of view, the Mediterranean is a whole, culturally as well as eco-historically. All right, well, let's now start getting down to it. So this is some sort of initial defamiliarizations, attempts to try and provide some different lenses of thinking about how we might want to relocate the Mediterranean as a world space. Let's take what I call a deep historical approach. In order to understand why the Mediterranean as a region, and not just the Muslim bits, was economically marginalized during the long 16th century, we've leapt ahead here, sorry about that, we need to insert it into the deep history of Eurasia. In this perspective, there is a family resemblance among the states and empires from China to the Mediterranean, becoming more markedly so as we move closer to the early modern period. The origins of agriculture, cities, and civilizations in Eurasia marked the transition of humanity to a new phase, the agrarian age, or as Brodel called it, the biological old regime. It governed human affairs from the first millennium BCE until 1750 CE. But starting around 1450 CE, some changes can be observed. Human populations across Eurasia expanded at a faster rate. States developed new military and organizational capabilities, as well as communications capabilities, printing, as well as maritime transportation. As the changes pyramided, states that were able to adapt to the new conditions of warfare, commerce, and communications achieved unprecedented power. Empires grew larger, populations grew to unprecedented levels. To fully comprehend what happened in the early modern period, it is useful to compare the eco-historical predicament and specific strategies of Mediterranean states with those of China, India, and Europe on the eve of modernity. Here is where a global and environmental perspective has much to offer. By 1450, the ecological constraints on growth were emerging in states all across Eurasia. Where China and India sought to exploit their internal frontiers, Western Europe's solution to the contradictions of population increase and ecological overshoot was to exploit its maritime advantage through overseas expansion. Europe's overseas colonies provided a strategic advantage in the new global struggle for empire and resources. As a result, it achieved levels of wealth and power well beyond agrarian norms. India and China pursued somewhat different strategies, and at this point I'm going to have to start cutting because I'm realizing where my time is. Let's just jump to the Mediterranean. What is the Mediterranean's eco-historical situation in, say, 1250 or wherever we want to start the clock? Situated at the junction point of Asia, Africa, and Europe, it had long enjoyed a central position in the topology of exchange within the Eastern Hemisphere. So much so that it indeed thought of itself as being a self-sufficient world. The vigor and dynamism of early civilizations is well attested. But starting around 1250, the Mediterranean found itself facing a series of eco-historical predicaments. The Mediterranean didn't, of course, because it's not a thinking person, but we might now look back upon this and see that it was indeed confronting a series of crises. First was the cumulative secular decline in agricultural productivity. Primarily as a consequence of irreversible processes of siltation and salination going back millennia, consequent to the introduction of irrigation, the decline in agricultural productivity was already evident by Roman times. As agricultural productivity slowed and even reversed, the population of the Mediterranean, which in 500 BCE had been more than double that of China. Did you know that? I didn't. I thought it was really interesting. More than double that of China, began to move in an opposite direction. By 1000 CE, pretty much China and the Mediterranean population, as I'm defining it here, are pretty much even. By 1500, China and India had forged well into the lead. By 1800, China had 4 times the population of the Mediterranean. Population increase I take as a kind of sign of increasing levels of efficiency of government and of agricultural systems to be able to support such large and varied populations. They signal important changes in land use, as well as the reduction in the role of pastoral production, which was a general problem that was confronting Asian civilizations from the Eastern Med on over in the post-Mongol era. All right, so that one problem then is population goes down, agricultural productivity is going down. That's a sign something's not working the way it used to be. A second major cause of the decline of the Mediterranean region is the transformation of its place in the system of global exchanges. For millennia, it had profited from its position aside world trade routes. But by the end of the 15th century, the Indian Ocean had already emerged to contest this. Some historians today speak of the Indian Ocean world as a larger and more important Mediterranean. This is by 1500. Then came the 16th century European Maritime Revolution, as a result of which eventually the Atlantic emerged as the center of the emergent world economy. These changes affected the Mediterranean in several ways. First, from a central role in the exchange of goods, ideas, and people within Afro-Eurasia, the Mediterranean became increasingly marginal to the new maritime global communications network. Second, as Europeans acquired direct access to American silver and West African gold, they marginalized the Muslim-dominated trans-Saharan trade routes that had previously been an important source of gold for Western Europe. American silver and West African gold allowed Europeans to participate in the global market in a way that left out the Mediterranean. Finally, the Mediterranean region, agriculturally depleted after millennia of intense agriculture, was left without a viable alternative strategy. With the emerging global world economy, the Mediterranean was becoming increasingly sidelined. But the woes continued. The impact of the Little Ice Age is the next thing we need to consider, a subject that has long since been absorbed by historians of Northwest Europe, but only recently have we begun to think about its potential impacts, actual impacts, upon the Mediterranean region. The historian Farouk Tabak, in his Waning of the Mediterranean, argues that the Little Ice Age had a cumulatively devastating impact upon Mediterranean agriculture, as torrential rains destroyed irrigation works and swamped coastlands became the site of endemic malaria. When combined with contemporary political changes, the decline of empires and the rise of piracy in the 19th century, it led to the long-term depopulation of large swathes of the Mediterranean coast. Finally, certainly by 1800, if not earlier, the region was beginning to face a potential energy deficit. While Western Europe as a whole had experienced rapid deforestation by the 17th century, the Mediterranean was arguably in worse shape. With its forests already significantly depleted by Roman times, the region's biomass resources, that's primarily wood here, declined further after 1500. By 1800, the region was facing a growing wood dearth. But unlike Western Europe, which enjoyed abundant deposits of coal, the Mediterranean was handicapped by the absence of significant deposits, thereby compromising its transition to industrialization. All right, so what's the point? The burden of the foregoing is that we do not need to seek cultural explanations for the decline of the Mediterranean region, nor is this decline something that is experienced only by part of the region and not the rest of it. All the technological cunning and all the good capitalist intentions in the world could not compensate for centuries of demographic decline, agricultural downturn, and deforestation. The undermining of agriculture by the Little Ice Age further weakened the position of the Mediterranean in world terms. Nor could Mediterranean states find an escape hatch from their reduced position in the topology of global exchange. Nor, finally, could they atone for the fact that when Mother Nature was distributing her goodies, the Mediterranean came up short in the coal department. Lacking both the ecological resources and strategic position to make the transition to the new eco-historical age of fossil fuels, the Mediterranean was one of the major regional losers within Eurasia since 1500. Okay, so there are compensations. There's the famous arrival in Italy of tomatoes and maize, for example. There are all sorts of other wonderful and unforeseen things that occur as a result of the 16th century voyages of discovery. Alas, I must pass over them rapidly because we are sailing on into heavier waters still. What I want to address next, whoops, what am I going to do here?
You still have another half an hour.
You think so? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, va bene. Okay. So if you finish first, let me know. So over the course of the long 19th century, 1750 to 1914, Mediterranean societies were powerfully shaken by the forces of what Eric Hobsbawm called the dual revolution. Those would be the industrial and the democratic. These days, I'd be inclined to add a communications one as well. But these changes were experienced differently by Mediterranean societies than by those of northwestern Europe. In the latter, after some initial difficulties, strong states and industrial economies were installed during the 19th century. Mediterranean societies, however, were slower off the mark because of delayed or muffled state formation and local elites bitterly divided over the necessity and aims of reform. Mediterranean societies were characterized to some degree or another by a semi-peripheral relationship to the world capitalist system. Weak state structures, delayed or muffled class formation, agrarian backwardness, and the continued importance of pastoralists. The region experienced the emergence of broadly similar types of social formations, elites and oppositions, and vectors of conflict. That's a mouthful, all right, and that's where we're headed in what follows next. Despite local variations, it's the common patterns that can be discerned in their responses to the challenges of modernization that I want to underscore in what follows. Thus far, we've observed that the transformation of the region as a whole was shaped by eco-historical and structural rather than supposed civilizational considerations. In this section, I suggest that from a world historical perspective, one can observe common responses by Mediterranean elites to the sweeping changes of the period, despite the manifold differences that characterized the experiences of individual Mediterranean societies. Confronting similar problems, Mediterranean elites sought to import the same blueprints to address them, and found themselves confronted by similarly patterned responses amongst the opponents of reform. One can also observe some important patterns to subaltern resistance around the region: peasant revolts, urban riots, syndicalist organizing. But fortunately for you, I do not have time this morning to discuss them. In a longer version of this paper, this is all laid out. An older historiography, perhaps impressed with the sheer scale of the Iberian, Habsburg, and Ottoman empires, saw them as all-powerful, world-bestriding colossi. Today's historians are more apt to describe them as pitiful, muscle-bound giants. A closer diagnostic reveals states and empires chronically incapable of exercising their control beyond the walls of their provincial capitals, reduced to governing through a plethora of placeholders and middlemen who exercised a rough-and-ready justice, generally for a price. The more historians have studied the old empires of the Mediterranean, the Ottoman and the Habsburg in particular, the more they appear to have been coalitions of interests, patchwork quilts of institutional structures, veritable museums of politics past, whose strategy seemed to have been to ensnare internal rivals in webs of privilege, or if that did not work, to expel them, while fostering sub-imperialisms like that of the House of Aragon in Italy. By the 18th century, the old structures were badly in need of an update, to which the Spanish Bourbon reforms and various abortive reform projects of the Ottomans testify. But the path to reform was strewn with obstacles. Entrenched agrarian elites and their allies in church and state sought to oppose encroachments upon their traditional privileges. It was in this context that the liberal project, or the French Reform Project, as I call this loosely connected bundle of political and economic reforms that derived from the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, erupted into the region. As modern states emerged along the North Bank, they developed new and more efficient and intrusive fiscal systems. These brought them into collision with old agrarian elites and established religious classes. Within this history, the Ottoman case, along with Egypt and Tunisia, differ primarily in degree. Would-be stateholders were no less jealous of their power and no less eager to demolish entrenched interests in the Muslim Mediterranean, and by the latter third of the 19th century, they had some solid achievements to which they could point. The Ottoman reform process, known as the Tanzimat, provoked a collision between reform-minded state bureaucrats and local elites and janissaries eager to defend their traditional rights and liberties. It also stimulated conflict with peasants and artisans, for whom the encroachment of the state was experienced primarily in the form of military conscription and increased taxation. Egypt and Tunisia had their own quasi-autonomous state-building programs. Though both were juridically part of the Ottoman Empire, they possessed their own autonomous capabilities of change. The reform impulse was weaker in pre-colonial Morocco, despite the accomplishments of Hassan I, who reigned from 1876 to 94, and in Qajar, Persia. Finally, we must recognize the colonial auspices under which reform was introduced, especially in the Maghreb, starting with the 1830 French invasion of Algeria. The introduction of liberal reforms, whether in the Ottoman Empire, France, Spain, and Italy, or the Maghreb, set off a struggle within the region that pitted reformist officials against rural interests. Appointed from the metropolitan centers, reformists were politically unaccountable to local groups. Culturally distinct from the local populations, they spoke different languages and operated in terms of different cultural assumptions than those under their charge, who mostly spoke some kind of local patois. Endowed with a sense of their own superiority to the locals by dint of their self-evident modernity, these agents of reform suffered epic frustrations. Sharing Orientalist stereotypes and racial prejudices about those whom they administer, they often resorted to force to carry out their objectives. In the process, they provoked much resistance. Unable to speak the local language or comprehend the diffuse structures of local power, other officials found themselves isolated and stopped trying, or retreated into their own privatistic worlds. The profound cultural abyss that separated reformist officials and progressive landlords and their respective Souths from their local administrative charges can be observed in such accounts as Carlo Levi's famous Christ Stopped at Eboli and the novels of Marcel Pagnol and Yashar Kamal. There's something deeply colonial that links the experience of these different Mediterranean populations at the hands of the modern state. What I'm trying to put into play here is, what does colonial mean? Right? What does it mean to say colonial? Did the Mezzogiorno have a colonial experience? Did Andalusia? Or indeed, did Turkish populations in Anatolia have a colonial experience, even though they were responding to their own indigenous elites who had incorporated and downloaded the French Reform Project? The incorporation of the Mediterranean into the world economy is a second major wave of change that we need to think about. The impact, the economic impact upon the Mediterranean in the long 19th century is primarily an experience of the urban areas and their immediate hinterlands. So the Marseille area, northern Italy, Barcelona, Salonika, Istanbul, the littoral of the Arab East. These are some of the citied areas that stood astride world communications links and therefore were particularly powerfully drawn into the new and emerging world economy. This new economy encouraged the rise of new urban middle classes whose fortunes were linked to northern European cities and elites, and fostered the emergence of an urban-based class of landowners who engaged in commercial agriculture for export. It provoked the decline of artisans and peasants across the region who were unable to adapt or unwilling to adapt to the changing economic tides. To the fiscal and other pressures of the centralizing state were added, therefore, additional ones based on incorporation in the capitalist world market. As with the enactment of state reforms, it is possible to detect the presence of semi-colonial patterns in the economic histories of the various souths of the European Mediterranean. Andalusia, parts of Languedoc, Corsica, the Mezzogiorno, Sicily. One detects a semi-colonial element as well in the dominance of the various Mediterranean souths by financial groups and institutions headquartered in the north, and in the transformation of the systems of landholding by liberal elites linked to northern Europe. Question: is the Piedmont northern? I ask the question in passing, but leave it to Italians to debate. But while the economic modernization of the Mediterranean region can be seen to have been structured by colonial relationships, at least in part, this is not the full story. The transformation of the systems of landholding and their dominance by liberal elites linked to Northern Europe is just one element of this. So, several decades ago, economic historians Jordi Nadal, Gérard Chastagneret, and Olivier Raveux launched a challenge to the standard history of how economic modernity came to the Mediterranean region. They took dead aim at the one-size-fits-all British model of textile-led industrial development, according to which the Mediterranean was seen as irrevocably backward since it did not conform. Instead, they argued for the existence of a specifically Mediterranean path to economic development. They noted that already by the 1830s, not the 1870s as some earlier historians had claimed, the metallurgical, food processing, and vegetable oil industries in Barcelona, Marseille, and Naples were centers of dynamism in the emerging modern economy of at least the Western Mediterranean. Upon closer inspection, it appears that even some 18th century latifundist proprietors in Calabria, long viewed by historians as hopelessly out of step with the new economic music, were more economically dynamic than previously believed, or so in any event we are told by Marta Petrusevich. The patterns of economic change were broadly similar in Ottoman domains, albeit with some important nuances. Lebanese silk entrepreneurs, sugar and cotton industrialists in Egypt, Ottoman entrepreneurs, most of whom were, of course, Greek and Armenian, participated in the industrialization of their respective economies, in partnership and often under the tutelage of foreign, especially French, interests. By the latter third of the 19th century, these enterprises were colonized by northern capital, both in the Ottoman lands as well as in France, Spain, and Italy, Greece as well. Historian Albert Hourani's Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age is in many respects a group biography and elegy for this cosmopolitan ruling group. Educated in Europe, they spoke English and French among themselves, often sat on the boards of directors of the same enterprises, such as the Sucrerie d'Egypte. Quintessential liberals, their nationalist vision readily accommodated European difference. The emergence of more deeply rooted cultural, populist, and radical nationalisms, starting with Ataturk in Turkey in the interwar period, sounded the death knell of this class. The 19th century communications revolution, our third vector of change, profoundly transformed Mediterranean lives and societies as well. It constitutes the third vector. The formative vision for the modernization of the Mediterranean as part of a world economy was initially provided by the French Saint-Simonian technocrats, whereas the 16th century voyages of discovery, which rendered the Mediterranean increasingly peripheral to the new Atlantic-centered world economy, for the Saint-Simonians, the introduction of the railroad and the steamship, regular steamship service between the Middle East and Europe dates from the 1840s, and the telegraph, London was linked to India as early as 1857, changed the place of the Mediterranean in the circuits of global exchange once again. And of course, the big bang here is the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, which in many respects makes up for, recenters the Mediterranean, puts it back on world time in a way in which it hadn't been since the 16th century processes of change I've talked about earlier. Railroads helped bring Egyptian cotton to the world market, along with Lebanese silk, Palestinian soap and olive oil, Sicilian and Andalusian grain. As a result of these changes in communication, shipping times between Europe and markets in Asia were dramatically reduced. Regular steamship transport linked the region to the Atlantic world and facilitated large-scale migrations of people to North America, South America, and Australasia. In world terms, the most significant transformation, alluded to just a second ago, I got impatient, was the opening of the Suez Canal. Along with the laying of the transatlantic telegraph cables and the inauguration of the American Transcontinental Railroad 6 months earlier, the Suez Canal made it possible to circle the globe in record time. Cumulatively, all of these changes restored the Mediterranean to something like its place in the circuits of exchange. As Mediterranean economies were drawn into colonial exchange, they also linked to global ones. Think, for example, of the trade in West African groundnuts, which develops in the 19th century. These innovations profoundly altered the spatial context of economic development of the region, securely linking it to global markets. With the decline of shipping rates starting in the 1880s, a transatlantic labor market developed, which drew increasingly numbers of Sicilians, Southern Italians, Maltese, Greeks, and Lebanese to L'America. The communications revolution greatly facilitated the migrations of people as well as goods across, within, and beyond the Mediterranean, a process that shows no sign of abating anytime soon. 4 broad types of migration can be distinguished. Other than distinguishing them, I can't really say more about them given time constraints. So one category are migrations out of the Euro-Mediterranean zone. These were primarily directed to the Americas and Australasia. Thus, 5 million Spaniards emigrated to the Americas in the period from 1820s to the 1930s, where they were joined by more than 10 million Italians. Lesser numbers of Greeks, Armenians, Lebanese, and Syrians left the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century as well. All told, close to 12 million Mediterranean men and women emigrated over the period, with the majority of departures coming after 1870. A second type of migration involved the movements of Mediterranean people within the Euro-Mediterranean arena. While the numbers of people involved were substantially lower than the long-distance travelers, they were nonetheless significant. Already by the 1830s, hundreds of thousands of Italian migrant workers were seeking economic opportunities in French, and later in the 19th century German, cities. Already prior to World War I, additional thousands of Spanish and Portuguese, as well as Algerian Kabyle, had found their way to French industrial job sites. These migrants were to be the forerunners of the waves of Iberians, Maghrebis, and others who had come after World War II. But these migrations lie outside our period. So let me make an effort at concluding, finally. In this study, I sought to re-examine against the background of world history how the Mediterranean came to modernity. It's intended to stimulate further thought, not foreclose debate. Modernity, I suggest, was the product of global processes of interaction of the societies of Eurasia together, rather than the result of the genius of a particular society. Against the grain of interpretations of European past, that view it as the beneficiary of foreordained destiny and impute moral superiority to the fact that Mother Nature happened to give them the coal, I suggest an alternate reading. It begins with the notion that there is something seriously flawed, about models of causality that view the society's let's restart that sentence. Something flawed about the models of causality that view the society's change in accord with inbuilt civilizational motors. While the rise of the West makes great ideology, it is poor history. Like Jared Diamond, I believe that we need to situate the fate of nations in a long-term eco-historical context. Unlike Diamond, a non-historian, I believe that the ways and the sequences in which things happen shaped what came next. The Mediterranean is a particularly useful case in this light. An ancient center of economic and cultural dynamism, its history provides part of the authorizing documentation that undergirds the European miracle literature, according to which the bouncing ball of historical change had jumped to northwestern Europe, leaving the Mediterranean dropped out of the narrative. The secular decline and deindustrialization of the Mediterranean in the long 19th century prefigures the fate of the Third World. No longer a center of progress after the 16th century, the decline of the Mediterranean is usually ascribed to its inherent cultural deficiencies. Amoral familism, patron clientelism, and religion are some of the favorite candidates. The civilizationist presuppositions of this approach are clear. In this respect, the search for what went wrong often typifies national histories around the Mediterranean. I've tried in this lecture to make a case for a comparative history of the Mediterranean as a world space. An exercise in mapping the global level of the Mediterranean, it is not a history, it is the prerequisite to a history. Necessarily, histories of the sort we are interested in occur at the sub-regional, national, or lower levels of magnification. By providing a topographical map of the entire region, I believe I've provided a disciplining context by which these histories can be evaluated. Examining the Mediterranean in such a context, our attention is directed away from internalist cultural models and towards larger determinants. By pursuing a comparative history of the Mediterranean, the power of Northern European narratives, in which the Mediterranean appears as marginal, are weakened. It becomes possible to imagine the possibility of Mediterranean models of modernity. Finally, a comparative history of the modern Mediterranean also has the potential to take us into new spaces that link its history to those of other world regions. All right. So let me end with a question. Is the Mediterranean fated to be a zone of cultural and civilizational conflict? If we consider the deeply rooted drive for cultural homogeneity that lurks within even French universalism and the no less deeply rooted responses to it, it is difficult to give a positive answer to this question. However, as I have suggested here, other histories exist, other ways of thinking about the region and its confrontations with modernity. It is important to encourage the development of these alternative histories if we do not wish to relive the dilemmas of civilizational history. Thank you.